Last part of today's session, and we'll have a presentation by Olivier Gevaert, and he is in fact a Belgian in America. He is a professor of medicine at the Stanford University School of Medicine, and he is focusing on multi-scale data fusion, which is in fact a multi-omics data fusion method, and he's going to explain us all about that. But perhaps a small story here. In fact, Olivier has been a PhD at the lab of Yves Moreau, one of the speakers in the breakout session at the department of Yves Moreau at the University in Leuven. And today he is, explained, linked to Stanford. Now, what is interesting as well is that the academic hospital of Stanford has 2.8 million patient records, so all based on OMOP, so very interesting data repository to perform research. And Olivier will talk remote to us. So, Olivier, to you the word.
Hi. Today I'm going to talk about multimodal biomedical data fusion with the Stanford Medicine Research Data Repository, also known as STAR. I hope I don't have to convince you that machine learning has been shown to be successful for biomedical data analysis for several heterogeneous data types. With biomedical data types, I mean lots of different types of data, including clinical data, such as demographics, family history, electronic health records, molecular data with genomics and transcriptomics, and biomedical imaging data, such as digital pathology and radiology. And many studies have shown that biomarker discovery from biomedical data contributes to precision medicine. But what is precision medicine? What do I mean with that? I mean optimizing the treatment of specific patients or subsets of patients using biomarkers. Original work in this area, in the area of precision medicine, has been really focused on molecular biomarkers, such as genetic biomarkers. But biomarkers can also be extracted from other routinely collected clinical or medical data, including medical images, such as digital pathology and radiology. And the goal here is to assign effective treatments to patients. So biomarkers can be used for more accurate treatment allocation. And molecular biomarkers might not be sufficient, especially in the context of complex diseases. So we should also consider other routinely collected clinical and image data and essentially fully take advantage of multimodal clinical data that's being collected for patients in a hospital setting. This is essentially being made possible thanks to evolutions in quantitative image analysis, in particular for whole slide images in pathology and radiographic images in radiology. And there's a huge need to develop models that can efficiently integrate multimodal data. What do I mean with multimodal data? I mean data that can characterize molecules, cells, tissues, and patients. And for each of these modalities, there's different technologies that can be used. For molecular data, we can use DNA and RNA sequencing. To characterize cells, we can use whole slide images, immunohistochemistry, and codex technologies, essentially any technology that results in digital pathology images. And for tissues, we can use radiographic images, such as MR images of the brain and CT images of the lungs, for example, to characterize tissues. And then at the patient level, we have electronic health records and their medical histories. So today I'm going to show you two examples. The first one being electronic health record data modeling using STAR data. And I'm going to give you an overview of the STAR data repository and what data is being made available for research. And I'm going to show you a demonstration use case with a tool that we have developed called SCOPE. So first of all, what is STAR? So STAR is the Stanford Medicine Research Data Repository. And Stanford exists of essentially three entities, which is the Children's Hospital, the Adult Hospital, and the Stanford School of Medicine, which represents up to 4 million patients. There are hundreds of active studies, thousands of researchers, and there's, as you can imagine, a multidisciplinary community and multiple stakeholders. Many different types of data are being analyzed and made available through this repository, including electronic health record data, radiology images, bedside monitoring, and so on. up to medical follow-up data, such as death data that's being collected thanks to, for example, the California Death Registry and also the Social Security Administration. This all started in 2017, and all these data types are being made available through different manners or different routes, from self-service tools to consultation services, and also there is a lot of training and office hours being made available. Another important point is that the STAR team has made all electronic health record data available in the Odyssey OMOP Common Data Model since September 2019. And in April 2020, also the Odyssey Atlas tool has been implemented, which is a system that can be used for cohort discovery, querying, and essentially live analysis of all electronic health record data of over 3 million patients that are in the Stanford hospital system. So how does this look? What is the data flow? So we have the two hospitals, the adult hospital and children's hospital. All data is being put into Clarity using BigQuery tables, and that is then transferred into OMOP per PHI data, which still includes private health identifiers. And then the identification protocols are being used to then generate de-identified data for research. So now that we have all this data available, what can we do with it? So we have developed a tool called Scope, which is a scalable and repeatable framework for modeling labs and diagnosis from electronic health record data. So what are we trying to do? So we are trying to predict the likely diagnosis at an encounter based on past medical history from the electronic health records. We are focusing on office visit encounters only. And applications of Scope are to help physicians save time during pre-visit planning, reduce physicians' documentation burden, and also reduce mistakes and missing values in electronic health records. So here's the data that we used from STAR. So we started with a cohort of 2.7 million patients. Then we filtered about 1 million patients that had office visit encounters. And then we filtered those back down to patients that had at least 2 encounters and 1 frequent diagnosis, resulting in over 500,000 patients. And these were then split into a training, validation, and a test cohort. So what is Scope? So Scope is a scalable one versus rest predictor. So what do we use as inputs? So we use the diagnostic codes of the past, so the past medical history. We also used labs and then demographic data, specifically age and sex. And the output of this model is the future diagnosis of the patient. We use a couple of different types of machine learning models, namely logistic regression, random forest, and deep learning. And we used a one versus rest modeling strategy to build these models. Finally, we also used sampling approaches to combat class imbalance, because you can imagine that there's a lot of sparsity in this data set with very frequent diagnosis, but many diagnoses only occur very infrequently. And that can be seen here, because we start with about 20,000 diagnostic codes. We reduce infrequent codes that occur less than 500 patients, resulting in about 2,045 codes. We also excluded chapters that are not related to diagnosis, so chapters in the ICD-10 vocabulary that represent symptoms or external causes of mortality, resulting in a final list of 583 codes that we use as labels in the model. Next, the next big data modality that we used from the electronic health record is lab values. We first harmonized the lab values and the lab names using heuristics. There's a lot of issues with labs and how they're being recorded, including common abbreviations, corrections for spelling, and so on. We also did the same thing as with codes. We dropped infrequent labs, resulting in about 1,504 lab values that were remaining. And then we also need to harmonize the values in the units, and we use the Pine package for this. So here are some results of this model. So using only diagnostic codes, we can see that we get a performance between 0.8 and 0.9 area under the ROC curve, across both logistic regression and random forest models. And what I'm also showing here is different aggregation of the medical history in days, looking at, for example, only the most recent 90 days, 180 days, up to 10 years of medical history. And what you can see, there's a slight improvement, adding more medical history, where essentially aggregating all medical history essentially resulted in the best performance across both machine learning models. And this is, again, using only diagnostic codes. Next, using the lab values only, we see that the performance is worse. Labs give a performance of between 0.7 and 0.8 area under the draw curve, and also adding more history gave a better result. Of course, we were mostly interested in combining all the available data, and this can be seen here. So again, you can see the performance of diagnostic codes, labs, and then the combination of both, and also a combination with demographic data. And in essence, combining all available data across the whole time horizon resulted in the best performance across all chapters. Another important aspect of scope of this model is the model interpretation. And we used Shapley analysis to visualize the results. So for each diagnostic code that we're trying to predict, we looked at the top 50 features that were needed to predict this code. We counted how many times these features occur, and then we use, for example, a word cloud visualization to look what are the most important features. Here I'm showing you the most important features for cardiovascular diseases. As you can see, age is of course an important predictor, and also other lab values are important, and previous medical history. Here's another way to look at this. This is a Shapley plot for heart failure, and you can see the most important predictors of heart failure. History of heart failure, of course, is important. Certain lab tests that are being used to diagnose heart failure are at the top of the list. Also, age is, of course, at the top of this list. Other risk factors for heart failure, such as atrial fibrillation, atherosclerosis, and hypertension, are in the top 15. And finally, a number of other labs are also selected in this model. So, to summarize this part, so we took advantage of the STAR tools to develop scope as a one versus rest model for predicting future diagnosis based on past diagnosis labs and demographic data. Scope is a transparent and interpretable modeling framework. And what is also important is that the one versus rest strategy is easily extensible to additional labels. So if we want to add more diseases to the model, it can be easily done. We also found that long regression windows are typically better. And the best result we got was combining diagnostic code labs and demographic data. Next, I want to show you a second example of how we use the STAR data, in particular STAR imaging data, where we are using deep learning on non-small cell lung cancer patients. So for STAR imaging data, we again have access to imaging data from both the children's hospital and the adult hospital, where all these different imaging data modalities, including, for example, cardiology and radiology, are being put in PACS systems, which are picture archiving and communication systems that are used across academic centers. All these different data modalities or images are then being ported into a vendor neutral archive, which then is being made available by STAR. One of the important tasks that is being done is the identification of this data, which is a petabyte scale, and a very highly performant pipeline has been set up to de-identify these images in the cloud. And the way that is being done has been made available to the community, and all the code that has been developed by the STAR team is essentially publicly available and can be reused. And this is continuously being updated by the STAR team. So how are we using this data? So we're essentially developing models for using convolutional neural networks to analyze lung cancer CT images. As you probably know, lung cancer is one of the most fatal malignancies in adults worldwide. And 85% of lung cancers are non-small cell lung cancers. And we are mainly focusing on this subtype of disease because it's the most common one. And lung computed tomography images or CT images are routinely used in clinical practice and one of the main modalities to diagnose the disease, follow up the disease, and determine treatment outcomes. So what have we done? So we essentially have developed a convolutional neural network to predict survival of lung cancer patients. So we're essentially predicting prognosis of these patients. Here are the cohorts that we used to develop this model. So we not only use data of Stanford patients, right, that was made available to us, but we also validated this model across a number of different institutions. So cohort 1 is a Stanford cohort of 129 patients. Then we use data from the Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida, from Maastro Clinic in Maastricht in the Netherlands, and from Charité Hospital in Berlin, Germany. So what is the model that we developed? So LungNet is a shallow convolutional neural network. We used the imaging data, and the tumors were segmented by radiologists. So each lesion was segmented manually, and a 3D patch was put around each lesion, and these masks, together with the images, were then fed to the shallow convolutional neural network. And the output of this model is essentially a hazard ratio that then can be used to stratify patients. We also use data augmentation, which is very common to train convolutional networks and to increase the amount of data to train this model, but also to make the model more robust against overfitting. So we used random flips, crops, changes in brightness, adding noise and small rotations to increase the data set and essentially avoid overfitting. So here is the model that we're using. So you can see the two types of images that we use as input. So the original lung images, 3D images, and also the 3D mask. They're being put into three convolutional layers. So this is a very shallow model in contrast to a lot of models that are being used in outside of medicine, such as ImageNet, which uses hundreds of convolutional layers. So we wanted to keep it simple and use a simple model for these lung images. And then after these three convolutional layers, there's three fully connected layers, and the output of this model is essentially a hazard ratio, which reflects the prognosis of the patient. So here are some results. This is the Stanford cohort. On the left, I'm showing you the LungNet model using the imaging data to predict prognosis, and on the right, I'm using only clinical data to predict prognosis, such as age, stage, and sex. Here are the results for the Moffitt cohort from the Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida. Again, showing on the left that we can separate significantly the poor and good survival patients. Similarly, for the cohort from the Netherlands, with a very significant split between the two groups. And finally, also in a smaller cohort from Charité Hospital in Berlin. Another analysis that we did is we focused on early stage lung cancers only because we wanted to also identify if we can also separate only stage 1 lung cancers in the three cohorts. So in the Stanford cohort, the Moffitt cohort, and the Maastro cohort. And as you can see, again, we were able to separate the poor from the good survival patients. So these results were recently reported in this paper, primarily showing that LungNet is able to predict survival across all these different institutions. So to summarize, we developed this shallow convolutional network model called LungNet, where we showed that the convolutional network or deep learning outperformed standard quantitative imaging techniques such as radiomic features. We also found that this model outperformed clinical data, and that adding clinical data did not change the performance. As I've shown you, it performed equally well on early stage cancers. And there's a number of work ongoing in this model. We want to see if we can develop separate models for adenocarcinoma and squamous carcinomas, which are two common histologies within non-small cell lung cancers. We also want to investigate the variability of the segmentations and also using deep learning to segment the lesions and investigating whether this will affect tumor performance. And finally, we want to also explicitly take into account CT acquisition parameters and see if harmonizing the variability in acquisition across institutes improves this model. But ultimately, we found that LungNet already generalizes well across institutions and can capture prognosis of lung cancer patients. Finally, I want to talk to you about our ongoing work in data fusion using star multimodal data, in particular to predict cancer survival. So our ongoing work is really focusing on bringing all these data modalities together in a multimodal data fusion framework, from genomics data to cellular data with digital pathologies, images, radiographic images, and then electronic health records, where essentially we want to use all multimodal data combined in a machine learning framework to predict overall survival. So to accomplish this, we have set up pipelines to ingest each of these different modalities. So omics data, digital images, 2D images from digital pathology, and 3D images from radiology, and combining these in using deep learning. So here is an example of one way of fusing different data modalities, where here we're using feature fusion of two data modalities, which is RNA sequencing and digital pathology, to then predict survival. We're considering several application areas. First, in neuro-oncology, we are developing overall survival models for adult glioma patients, and then also transfer learning these models to more rare pediatric brain tumor types, where we don't have enough data to actually build the models from scratch. In lung cancer, we're interested to predict treatment outcomes from non-small cell lung cancer patients. And in head and neck squamous carcinoma patients, we are interested in subtyping using both molecular and imaging data modalities, because we have shown that several subtypes exist in this heterogeneous disease that need different treatments. So to summarize, multimodal data is being collected and made available in STAR for the Stanford research community and beyond. Harmonized metadata is very important. In particular, the OMAP common data model is allowing to also port these models that we have developed across different institutions. Ongoing work on de-identification and expanding data sources by the STAR team is being done. And all this work essentially enables machine learning and AI work on real-world clinical data. And a promising application that we are focusing on is precision medicine using multimodal data, in particular for biomarker discovery. Here are the people I have to acknowledge for this work. So the people in my lab, plenty of collaborators, and also my funding from the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. And I thank you also for your attention.
Er is geen vragen. Het is gelijk aan jou. Er zijn geen vragen.
Good afternoon. It seems we are immediately jumping into the panel discussion, as we don't have questions. So I would like to call the panel members to the front. Gabriel Chodik from Maccabi-Tech, Bart van Nieuwenhuizen, Lisbeth Peters van de Universiteit Hasselt, Heidi Mertes, excuseer. En Nick Marly, ik weet niet of dat hij al aanwezig is. Momentje. Voilà. If not, Nick Marly will join us in a few minutes, as he confirmed. But I'm sure we can already start with this discussion. First of all, I would like to introduce our panel members, some familiar faces, but also a few new faces. Let me start with the ones we already know. Gabriel Chodik, coming from Maccabi Tech. He's head of the Maccabi Tech, which is part of Maccabi Healthcare, as we have learned this morning. Quite an influential institution within the Israeli healthcare system. He has a PhD degree from the Tel Aviv University in epidemiology and preventive medicine. Bart van Nieuwenhuizen, next to me here, and who was so kind to fill in one of the speakers.
That's how I am.
Voilà, there you are. He is Senior Director, Health Information Sciences at Janssen, and very passionate about data sciences, of course. And he's been with Janssen for some while now, with in different roles with growing responsibilities. He has a degree in biology of the University of Ghent and an MBA of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Heidi Mertes, she's the professor at the University of Ghent in ethics, and she was one of the founding members of the Bioethics Institute in Ghent, and her academic research focuses a lot on ethical implications of innovation in healthcare, and today often initiated with big data, as we also already learned from her presentation earlier on, and how this also can destabilize the current ethical frameworks. Lisbeth Peters is the new face in this table, and she is she has a master's and PhD in bioengineering from the University of Leuven, but today she is assistant professor in biomedical data sciences at the University of Hasselt. And I've read that this has turned her into an activist, if I may say so, for open sciences and fair data. Welcome to all of you. And in order to set the scene a little bit, I just want to refer back to the presentation that Dirk Rijn gave this morning, and just pick out a few statements. For instance, that Belgium is top in innovative biotech and pharma. In fact, we take the 3rd place worldwide in biopharmaceutical export, which has a value of 56 billion euro. That the sector of biotech and pharma provides jobs to some 40,000 Belgians, which is more than twice the European mean. That our academic research centers at the universities, but also the research centers, are excellent, and they are an engine of innovation, which feeds, of course, in this rich ecosystem. And then, of course, the most recent initiative, the Flanders Health Tech, which was also introduced by Dirk this morning. And on a perfect timing, I'm happy to welcome Nick Marly to the panel. He's an engineer by training, has been active in education and research for a long time, but then after being an ICT manager for a few years, and also for the Belgian RISIF, he started at the end of 2020, if I'm not mistaken, at the cabinet of Minister Van den Broeke, Health and Social Affairs. And he is in charge, following up with the e-health and health data domains. In addition to coordinating the different agreements, the vaccination campaign in Belgium, the digital COVID certificates, etc. So quite a bit busy times still today, I think. So thank you for joining us, absolutely. Right. After these positive statements, I was a bit surprised to learn a recent quote from Lisbeth Peters, who said, well, I believe that our healthcare system of today is just not good enough. I think we need some more explanation on that.
Okay. Yeah, so the new kid on the block can start. So indeed, I always say that, and it is definitely, first of all, it is not because I believe that the people within our health and care system are not good enough. That is a very different thing. But what I believe is that there is so much more that can be done. And therefore I am frustrated, because I believe that there are many urgent questions where the answers and the insights to those questions could transform our health and care system of today. And what frustrates me even more is that the technical solutions to accomplish that exist. Because there are fascinating examples. We've seen many of them in the Stanford talk of just leading up to this panel debate. We can pre-process, we can wrangle, there are explainable AI, federated learning, we have VR, distributed, privacy preserving, all these things are possible technically. But because the lack of bringing those two worlds together, and then I am referring to the people, so the people within the worlds of medicine, biomedicine and rehabilitation sciences, and the people within the world of technology, AI, VR, they cannot talk to each other. And I believe that the innovation happens at the intercept, and therefore we cannot address one of these questions. And this leads to slow diagnosis, slow prognosis, slow treatment, and some very concrete examples of some urgent questions that are very difficult to handle are: what's the effectiveness of the vaccine in a real-world setting? We are releasing all these vaccines into the market. How do they work when we're actually using them in patients that were originally excluded in our clinical trials? How can we assess and improve the reimbursement of some drugs that are focusing on patient-relevant outcomes that we're not measuring, like cognition and depression, and so on? That's just what I mean with that statement.
Okay, that's setting the scene, I think. Thank you. Bart, from an industry perspective, from Janssen, do you agree? Is this?
Who am I to make a statement on this? About let me stick to what we know best, which is life sciences research, maybe. And of course, I completely agree with the statements that Dirk also made in the opening presentation. That I mean, that there are loads of great stuff happening within our region. I mean, we are an innovation powerhouse. There are lots of brilliant startups in life sciences and biotechnology. I think that's obvious. So I think that's the positive. When we look at what would further stimulate innovation and drive innovation, I think there is a big gap that we see, and that is around the availability of routine care data, so-called real-world data, to drive the innovation engine further. And where I agree with Lisbeth is that the first aim should be to service doctors and patients better. I mean, it should come to the benefit of our healthcare delivery, but then I think an immediate derived benefit can come also from for life sciences research companies. But if the benefits are not balanced, if it's, for instance, only a benefit for life sciences research, I don't think that's sustainable. It has to be a benefit for both sides of the equation. Both care and research should benefit from it. But I agree with Lisbeth in that sense that we do have a challenge within this country with availability of routine care data for research purposes. Maybe
Nick, could you comment as well? Because as with your role within the cabinet at this point in time, but also your past roles, what about the lacking data or the usability of data?
Well, we have experienced, sorry that I could not join the presentations this afternoon, but I had other things to do. Yeah, I agree with the lack of data. We have seen this also in the complete pandemic and the struggle against the need of data. It's still difficult, for instance, to get ICU data. And to make conclusions about that would be very, very helpful. Yes, we are taking actions. We are currently working on the establishment of the Health Data Authority, which should integrate in the European health data space. We're doing this for the moment just on a federal level with 5 institutions. The founding paper is ready. We're going to progress on that. We're going to contact other stakeholders in the area, insurance companies, hospitals, the deelstaten, the federated entities, so that we can make a broker, establish a broker to make data available quickly, swiftly, good quality, harmonized procedures, legal base, all that you want. Based also on the European Data Governance Act, which is under construction. So we are working on it. We not only have a roadmap, a fourth roadmap 2020-2024 for e-health, we're also going to put in place a roadmap for health data. There's also some financing that has been provided to hospitals to establish these data capabilities, so we're working on it.
And what are the main challenges that you still foresee in the near future to accomplish all that? Is that the different stakeholders, getting them together, or?
Well, one of the main challenges, I think, I've been quite busy with legislation the last couple of months, is going to be legislation, I think. In fact, we have a perfect storm for the moment. We have the privacy law, which is under evaluation. We have the law for patient rights that has to be evaluated next year, and where it's still mentioned that a physician has to share its data on paper with the patient. I think we should end this once. We have the European Data Governance Act. We have the legislation specific for the Health Data Authority. That has to be put in place. One of the first things that we have to do, really, that we have to start is creating a correct legal basis, because this takes time. It's also something that needs a democratic process. Citizens have to be involved. A parliamentary discussion has to be possible. You're going to touch their data. They have to have something to say about it. So very important that we get this right and that we get this done right.
Gabriel, if we go to Israel, we've seen your example this morning, quite inspiring, I think, for all of us. Could you share again, I'm not sure if everybody saw the presentation, maybe a few examples on how you have, or Israel is approaching this, and maybe share some take-home messages or learnings that could help us in this path?
I think the question was whether data can be used for research, and can we know more about how effective the vaccines are, medications. Well, I can provide example I mentioned maybe earlier today. During the epidemics, there were concerns about pregnant women getting the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. And pregnant women are not included in the clinical trial for obvious reasons. So, you know, the Ministry of Health was not very clear about this point and his stand, and many pregnant women did get the immunization. So we used that to do a research that was eventually published in the JAMA, showing the the safety of the vaccine, the effectiveness. But I don't think that every organization needs to do the research. I mean, you can do it once, twice, maybe several times, but that's it. I mean, I don't think that every organization needs to have the capabilities and a research center. The major use of data is not for research, at least for my understanding in care providers, is for better care. And that's a much deeper, much more complex issue than rather conducting an epidemiology research. Maybe I can also give an example of AI. We have a pathology lab where the images were stored in the old-fashioned way, on a plate of glass for many years. And several years ago, we thought, why not transforming that into digital pathology and making an AI from that. And indeed, together with a company called IBEX, they were able to come up with an algorithm that identified prostate cancer through the pathology slide. That was very successful, but it's, the major task, or major efforts is not getting the algorithm. It's relatively easy. The major issue is to replacing the pathologist, and that wouldn't happen in the next decade, or at least decade. So what we use now is we use this AI as a safety net for negative result. If a patient has a negative read, we run the algorithm on that. So it's a safety net, but it's a very minor place. You know, from all the AI investment and excitement, we end up with a very minor improvement in care. So we have to be realistic here. Thank you.
Yeah. And going to the patient as well, because we've heard Hedi's presentation earlier today as well. If you listen to that and you see the European context of the patient involvement, the ethics, is this something, if you look at what's been done with within Maccabi Health Services, does that fit with the patient and ethics perspectives that you've heard here today? Gabriel, it's actually a question for you.
So, you know, the ownership of data is a complex issue. First of all, it has to be clear that our major mission and major goal is to improve care and for the benefit of patients. It's not making money. We're a non-for-profit organization. We barely survive, you know, financially, so everything is okay. I think that, you know, if the way to hell is paved with good intentions, if we would need an opt-in for the secondary use of data from 2.5 million people, including those who have died, and we still use their data, it might be challenging, we would never do anything. So we have to be realistic. We must let opt-out an option, rarely done in real world, and at least in our case. But we have to be very careful with any decisions that really, in the end of the day, will hurt primarily our patient members. So I would be very careful with any moves that may affect that, the use of data.
Hedi, could you also comment on that?
Yes, I agree that when you say that it's impossible to let 2.5 million people consent, I think we have opt-outs for several, like for example, for organ donation in Belgium, we have an opt-out system. Now, the requirements for an opt-out system normally in medical ethics is that you make sure that everybody knows that if they do not opt out, they opt in. Otherwise, you don't have a consent. It only counts as a consent if you know. So in Belgium, I would say that the majority of people know if they have a car accident, and you know it is legally. Usually they'll ask. Well, always they'll ask the family, but in principle, you can donate. If it were the case that we would not be telling the Belgian population that this is the case, and then we do an opt-out, then it's not an ethically fine system. So if we transfer this to this context, I also imagine a system where we don't have an opt-in for each and every research project. I think it's not feasible. Although some people think it is, so I have to give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe. But then it's very important that people know what happens to the data and that they can opt out if they want to. And I don't know how it is in Israel, but I suppose that people are aware that if their data are in your I can't say company, but in your insurance system, that they know that it will be used. And in that case, I think it's fine to use an opt-out system. And you can also imagine that for certain applications, you would still require an opt-in if it's really very sensitive research, very sensitive data that you're dealing with, but that for more general data, for example, checking if the COVID vaccine has an impact on pregnant women, I don't know why anybody would really object to their data being used for that purpose. And I actually agree with what was said before, that it's, I think, a moral imperative that we do more of this kind of research, because I agree that there are so many drugs, if I'm not mistaken, maybe Bart will correct me or not, but I think the primary reason why drugs are being taken off the market is because there's a side effect in women. And we are half the population. So you would think that it would be nice that if data can be gathered in the population to see are there side effects or children. I think it was a Nurofen that was on the market for quite a long time. People giving it to their children years and years and years, but we can't include the children in clinical trials because that's unethical. Well, I have a bit of a problem with this. Then we have to see the entire population as one big clinical trial. If that, I mean, preferably not, but if that's what we're doing anyway, then please get the data and use the data to make it better. So in that case, I think, yeah, I agree with a lot of what has been said, but I think it is important that you make sure that people know what's happening, and that if it's sensitive, please give them the option of, yeah, opting in or opting out.
Okay, thank you. Nick, is this helpful to develop the legislation, or?
I have the record of the fastest law that passed, collaboration agreement that passed the parliament in 1 week. Parliament, Conseil d'État, the whole bunch. So I can move quickly if you want to. No, I think this there is a huge responsibility on the industry here also. I think the trust building, the communication, the transparency has to be there. I read about a situation in the UK where there was a people's dynamic who started saying, okay, we are going to do an opt-out, we don't trust it anymore, I don't know the exact situation, this should be avoided. You cannot enter into this situation. Not good for anyone, not good for the citizens, because they limit the research on personalized medicine or whatever, and not good for the industry, R&D, because they have no more data. So we should not end there. Let's do a good job. Maybe we are a little bit late, that could be, we're always a little bit late in Belgium, but we have the time to do a good job.
I can only agree with you, Nick, of course. And I think maybe the fact that we are not with the leading group is the benefit of lessons learned from the others. So, we completely agree, of course, with the trust building. That's also what I mentioned in my presentation. We are very, very aware of trust building, and obviously we want to be a trustworthy and trust-deserving partner. In that regards, I think we are absolutely okay with following all of the governance and the approval cycles that are required. So I don't think that's where the discussion sits. I think that the discussion really sits in having sufficient volumes of data available, readily available for research. And the research, again, should be for anyone. It also for improvement of delivery of care, also for pharmacovigilance, for instance. I mean, and in that regard, I think that the initiative from EMA to build this Darwin network to indeed have a fast network for signal detection, I think that can only be applauded. You wouldn't want a drug to be on the market for 2 years longer if a certain subgroup of patients is very susceptible to side effects, for instance. You wouldn't want that. But I think that we're really struggling, I think, in this country to even make the data which is already available or which is around, make that available for research. I mean, think of the EMA database. I mean, that's 11 million Belgians. All of my data sits there. I think we can find ways of making that data, preparing the data better to make it available for research. And then the research, of course, should be first approved through the normal procedures of governance. That's not what we're debating, of course. Yeah.
Lisbeth, yes.
Yes, exactly. So I have some tips to help him with the governance and use. So I think indeed that we should tackle the problem in the complexity that it deserves. That is indeed what I think. Our health and care system is complicated. We have all these stakeholders. We have all these questions. There is this ethics and this legal. And sometimes when I talk to journalists, I say there is this episode in Shrek. People who've seen it's very good. And he says, ogres are like onions. And Donkey says, but not everybody likes onions. And he still says, yes, but ogres are like onions. So our health and care system is an onion, okay? So maybe you do not like an onion, but it is an onion. So it is complex, it has all these different layers of complexity, so we should tackle it in the way it deserves. And at the same time, we should also be pragmatic. And sometimes we are complexifying it, and therefore there is no solution. So the complexity can also paralyze. And therefore, I also think that there are small things that we can agree upon, which is the minimal fairness. Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable that we could all agree on. The data should be minimally findable. At least the metadata should be publicly available. The dictionary should be there, and you should have the counts. Which should be minimally accessible, which means that it should be in a space where if all ethics and legals are agreed upon, at least we can access it. It should be minimally interoperable. We should agree upon a common data model or a standard that we all implement locally so that we can scale. And it should be minimally reusable. And I think that that is the key for the governance and use. Sometimes we try to come up with one governance model that rules them all. And that will never happen. I would already be so happy if I can walk in every hospital or any health and care institute, an entity that controls or acts as a data custodian of a data source. And I can talk to the CEO, the data manager, and just the clinician that is entering the data, and they know what a common data model is, why it is useful, why they should collect their data in a structured way using any data acquisition that helps them to support that, and that actually it is useful and necessary, that the data should be as open as possible and as closed as needed, because sometimes we underestimate the value. Data saves lives. I have the PIN, many others have it as well. We should look at the data as a crucial part of our health and care system. And I think if we just shift the debate on governance and use just a little bit, instead of focusing on this governance principle that rules it all, let's focus that every entity has a protocol in place that allows them to go from, there is a question, can I reuse your data? And they know what should be done to answer the question. Whether or not it's yes or no, nobody should care. But just they have the process in place. They know who to call. They know the DPO is informed. The ethical approval understands what it means. And they can at least make the decision, whether or not it's yes or no. And then we're not really, because we're always talking about the chicken, right? What should the chicken do? And then we're talking about the eggs. Whereas if we just focus a little bit on what happens inside the egg, and let's accelerate that, I think that that can be a major acceleration, and it could be done short term. And it's about education and awareness raising, and about agreeing as an ecosystem. This is what we think is minimally what everybody should be doing.
And I think you're all Shrek fans, but no. But picking up on that, isn't it, because we heard José in his talk saying, if I recorded it well, that some 85% of the French people feel that data sciences, AI will improve their health. If I look at, listen to the examples Gabriel brought up, that if you ask your members to give a sample readily, 50% actually do that. So aren't we indeed making it too complex? Isn't there a lot more trust that we have? And then at the same time, you have a Facebook campaign where you start explaining a lot, and then you see, now we are actually dismantling this trust a little bit. So isn't it time to do what Lisbeth mentioned? And Hedy, I think that would be a good question for you too.
Yeah, because I want to make a footnote there, though. I'm aware of a study, but I can't recall who performed the study, but in the US, where for a group of people who all consented, so they're all people that were in the same hospital, they all consented that their data could be used by the hospital, and that in fact it could be sold by the hospital, so in an aggregated form. And then there was a study looking at, how would you like the income that the hospital generates with your data? How would you like us to allocate it? Would you like us to spend it on research projects in your specific disease, or can we use it for something else? And so while she was conducting this research project, she got a lot of angry patients saying, what, are you selling my data? Why are you doing this? This isn't fair. And then she said, oh, but you signed the informed consent. Look here, you gave your consent. So I'm not sure if it's because so many people say, okay, I agree, that they really agree to each and everything that we are then actually doing with it. So it's the same as when you click the terms and conditions, you accept the terms and conditions, but you don't really know what you're accepting. I mean, and I'm also a victim of that. I mean, I try to avoid it when I can, but sometimes it's just easier to click it. So I think we have to be careful here that I think it is correct that many patients are really willing to share their data for the greater good, but at the same time, we have to be careful that when we are taking that data and doing something with it, that it is not something that they just haven't thought about that you could also be doing with it and that they do object to. Like if I can refer to the autism research that I referred to in my talk. So the people gave an explicit consent, but maybe they didn't really overthink like, oh, but maybe what are the consequences of this type of research? What will it mean for stigmatization of people with autism? So I think we really have to tread carefully. It's not because people say, oh, it's fine to use my data, that we should say, oh, okay, so we'll just grab all the data and go. I would plead for some restraints.
Yeah, Bart,
yeah, and that's also why I believe that there should be data custodianship. I mean, again, about the individual patients and individual patients deciding on reuse of their data for a certain research topic, yes or no. I mean, it's sometimes very difficult to evaluate whether a research topic is actually appropriate or not. So if even you see how many discussions we may have with an ethics committee who are not clear or who are sometimes split. So how can an individual citizen then make that decision? That's one. The second is, to your point also in your presentation, Heidi, what about dynamic consent? How often are they going to be willing to, when will they be fed up with giving consent? I would be fed up after a couple of requests. But so that's all of the more reason to really see that there is a data custodianship that really looks after the benefits of the patient and also the returns. And again, I mean, from a life sciences industry, we're happy with that. I mean, we're happy to interact with ethics committees, with legal departments, with the DPOs in the various institutions. We do it all the time. Where we do see a need is indeed a deeper understanding of some of the novel concepts that are being brought, like federated networks, like distributed learning, where the data stays local and the analysis goes to the data, privacy-preserving methods, which are not revealing any privacy of patients. So I think we need more education maybe, or more dialogue on the benefits, also the challenges of these types of methods, but I think that's the way to go. And I was trying to find another title of a movie, but Lisbeth is incredible. I mean, having the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, you had the perfect storm already, so. but mentioning Lord of the Rings and Shrek in one go, I mean, who is Shrek? I hope I'm not Shrek. Nick wanted to add something.
Yeah, please.
Briefly.
Yeah, I have also my favorite movie. I always say when I come here, I'm not the Oracle from the Matrix. It's not because I work at the cabinet since the beginning of this year that I have the truth in me. So it's not true. I'm always happy to have teamworks, and I think Elizabeth recited almost 99% of the founding paper of the Health Data Authority. So well done. I don't know who gave it to you, but good work.
Yeah, maybe I was a little bit in the back and you didn't know.
Then it will be good. Then it will be good.
No, I just wanted to add a very small thing because we're talking about trust, and for me that is a wrong word for the debate, because trust is a feeling and you can never change a feeling, nor should you just say, just trust me, right? Because what you can change and evaluate and improve is behavior. And trustworthiness is something you can evaluate, and where at least there can be a code of conduct, basic principles that we could agree upon as an ecosystem. This is what we believe is trustworthy. So that if somebody behaves not trustworthy, there is also the power to publicly shame them. Because otherwise the ones that are not trustworthy are affecting the ones that are doing everything they can. And I believe that indeed a very good guiding principles or code of conduct, and that is why I'm really hopeful about these health data spaces discussions, where at least we went through the difficulties of coming up with the GDPR. And of course it's not perfect, but at least there is a baseline. And I think in the health data space, many of us are trying to have that debate. As European citizens, what is trustworthiness for us? What is good research, and what is research that is unacceptable? And again, there, when you read these concept notes, many of these things are obvious. But having them on paper, having them go back and forth to the European Commission and back to the member states is a very useful exercise. So instead of talking about trust, I think we should be focusing on trustworthiness, which is a very different concept.
The Blame Game is another movie. But I agree with you, Lisbeth, and I think that you recently, with the installation of your Data Science Institute, you gave Dr. Honoris Causa to Deepak of the IHD, and I know that they are working on this definition of what is bona fide research, which is obviously a difficult topic, and sometimes it's easier to define this by exclusion rather than saying what exactly it is. But these are discussions that we obviously also like to contribute to from our perspective, and I think it's a useful and a necessary discussion to have. First, maybe within the scientific community, but definitely also in a broader context with the citizenship.
Maybe back to you, Gabriel. This concept of trustworthiness, how is that managed within Israel Maccabi?
So in the past, we did a study asking about who you trust more, the government, your HMO, and other. And we were ranked very high, while the government was ranked very low. And that's why we were objecting any idea of a national health record that several years ago was in the air. I don't think that the data should be transferred anywhere from your health provider. And the data federation and other solutions might be more sensible than sending the data to the government. Israeli government is already swamped with issues that, all kinds of data privacy and badly use of data. So I don't think that we should get there anyway. Let's keep away from the government. That's at least in Israel. At least in Israel, I'm telling you honestly. I mean, and they know our stand. As for the industry, and we work a lot with the industry. Typically, we don't have any issues with data privacy. The industry is typically not interested in individual level of data, but we do have issues in market share, in commercial information, in cost, marketing studies where we were totally blocked. So data is not only, the issues with data is not only privacy, there are many, many other issues between the different stakeholders. But again, everything has to be very transparent and set and agreed upon while contracting. That's all I have to say.
Can I add a small comment? Because I looked it up last week in another context what the trust in government is in Belgium as compared to Scandinavian countries. Because the big example are often the Scandinavian countries. I'm sorry, and in fact, so the recent data from the ACO, I'm sorry, I can't remember, but the most recent data are that in Scandinavian countries it's around 60%, and in Belgium it's around 30%. So it's really significantly lower. And I wouldn't conclude from that necessarily that then we have to give or leave the data with the health insurance companies in Belgium. But I do think that for government it is something to keep in mind, that although we have, as Belgians, a lot of trust in the healthcare system, people trust their physicians a lot. So we have to make sure that we don't erode that trust, and that we maybe try to establish more trust in government as related to healthcare anyways. But it's something to keep in mind. I think it's an important issue that people, unfortunately don't trust government. So if you say, oh, just give the data to us and we'll take care, it might be a problem, I think.
You don't know which government. We have so many.
But I don't think any government is really popular.
Best not to go there, I think. But Nick, maybe, it would be good for... Normally it's just...
I wanted to pop the same question. Which government did they talk about? Difficult. We are also a country with not the same vision all over the country. That is also something very difficult to handle. I have no perfect solution. I think indeed we should show via evidence base, if I may say it like that we are trustworthy as a government. I'm a research guy. I wouldn't do anything wrong with data. It was an engineering research guy, okay. But we have to show that we are worth it of handling the data of our citizens, that we do this in a deontological way, that we have had the discussions and the input of our citizens to assure them that we do want to provide better care, better medication, better health, better quality of life for our citizens. That's what we should do.
I think this is the perfect line.
You want to stop?
No, I want to open the room for questions. Is that okay? Or you had an urgent movie? No, okay. The questions from the room, please. Or online. There's a question here. If there's other questions, you may raise your hands already.
I hear there's money available. I hear technology is ready. I hear ethics is in place, in fact. So why don't we just start? So maybe we can do a pilot. If we wait until all the laws are ready, and then we start to find out how we are going to manage this in a technical way, it will take far too long. So let's do things in parallel. You take care of the money, you take care of the laws, and let's just start with a couple of people who are interested in making it kind of proof of concepts.
So maybe me first, because I will help you again a little bit. Because the word "let's start" assumes that we are playing a finite game. And I think it is very crucial for all of us to understand that when it comes to health data, big data, governance and use, that it is an infinite game. So, which is the main difference between a finite and an infinite game? A finite game, there is a close, there is a beginning, there is an end, everybody knows the players, and there are clear rules. That is a finite game, football. An infinite game is that there is no clear start and stop. There are known and unknown players, and the rules are unclear. So this is an infinite game. So if you ask when let's start, then I think that many of us have started already many years ago, which doesn't mean that we can further accelerate. So I would reformulate the question. How can we further accelerate the infinite game instead of starting? And then maybe Nick can respond to that.
Politics in Belgium is, I think, an infinite game. No, you're right. When I talked about the health data roadmap, I did not mention the two paths, a parallel path. First, getting the things defined and right, legal base, processes, harmonization, transparency. Second part, I've been talking to a lot of professionals already who are interested to start now, who are already trying to find how can we use, explore, not exploit, bad word, explore, or do more with the data that we have. And give reference to the diabetes fund, the pathological professionals with the slicing, digitization of the slicing also that they want to do. There's a lot of interest, and we have to advance in these on a parallel track with the data that is available. But do not forget the 6 questions of the data authority, data protection authority. We have to ask these questions.
Let's maybe not forget life sciences industry. We'd like to play with you in that infinite game, and we are not happy to stay just on the sideline. We don't want to be ostracized in this. We really believe we have something to contribute, and I very strongly believe that we can work together in a co-creation setting so that we can deliver solutions that are working for everyone. Also for the life sciences industry, which is really vibrant in this country. We are leading also, for instance, with regards to clinical trials. But we know that going forward, if we are not successful in better using our routine care data to inform and to use in the context of clinical trials, for instance, that we will be slipping, we will be losing our leading position. So a strong plea here also for us to be allowed to play at the table, Lisbeth.
There was another question.
Thank you for a great discussion. I recently read a letter by Ali Parsa, and Ali Parsa is the guy who started up Babylon. Babylon is one of the unicorns. It's an app that basically is contracted by NIH, by a couple of states in the US, and by Rwanda to provide actually algorithm-based simple solutions to patients. And the best quote he had was that we don't have a healthcare system, we have a sick care system. And could we start using data to focus much more on prevention and get to healthcare? So just wanted to throw that into the group and see everything that you've discussed. Is there something that could be easier when you focus on prevention rather than on the patients and the patient data?
Maybe Gabriel as well, because you have already so much data that you're working with. What about prevention?
Well, it sounds nice, but reality is more difficult. You know, when we have discussions every year about new technologies, for some reason, oncology wins. Although we talk about a lot of money for very few patients, you could invest in prevention, you know, better prevention, better screenings, colonoscopy for everyone. But there is a one rule that the patient that suffers is getting a preference, no matter how cost-effective it is. So it's very difficult to talk about prevention-oriented care. In reality, it's very challenging. So we do our best efforts, but it's always secondary to the primary issue of getting the patients the treatment they need now.
Can I maybe also respond? I'm of course for prevention. I think it's better to prevent than to heal. But I do think that there are a number of problems there as well. For example, well, regarding healthcare costs, in the sense there's this idea of, or this concept of the healthy ill, which is in certain preventive measures, for example, in genomics research. So if I have a genome analysis and I get, you know, I get scores saying I have an increased risk of this and that, and then well, you could say, oh, that's great, then you can take preventive measures. But at the same time, I will be starting to access healthcare that I might actually never need because I have maybe a 70% chance of getting something, but not a 100% chance. So you also get this other dynamic, I think, unfortunately connected to preventive healthcare, that you are driving people to healthcare that don't need it, and that you're overusing our scarce healthcare resources that we already have. So we'll have to see if it balances out in the end. If in the end we can prevent more people getting ill and save costs there, so that it doesn't matter much, then it might be fine, but it might not be. Like the example I gave from the sepsis. So if you're giving antibiotics to a bunch of people who don't need it because you want to do it preventively, then you're also causing harm in the long run. So I think it's a fine line to walk, but I think it's important to look at prevention anyways, but oftentimes I'm maybe a bit ironic in the sense that oftentimes the advice you can give to people if you can do all kinds of tests beforehand is eat healthy and exercise. And then I wonder, why are we going to do many tests to tell them eat healthy and exercise? And people aren't even doing that. So that's another aspect. Even if we know that people, if they get information, predictive information, so about their risks, once they get the information the first week, like you have high cholesterol or you have a chance of getting higher cholesterol, well, the first week in the grocery store, they will buy the cholesterol-free butter. But then next week, well, they can't find it right away. So they'll, after a couple of months, it weighs off and people don't act on it anyways. So we have to, I think, do a lot of sociological research into this as well. Will it work, and how will it work, and how can we make it work to the benefit but not to the disadvantage?
I think we're almost ready to close, but Lisbeth sounds like the best person to do that.
No. So indeed, I think prevention is a great research question, and it's not about a research question. It's about building an ecosystem of trustworthiness that is multi-stakeholder and that accelerates a number of different questions. And to end with a fairy tale or a movie, to remember that everybody knows that the piglet who made the house of stone is the only one that made it for the wolf. So we have to build the house of stone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, our panel members. Thank you for your attention and questions.
Okay, so after the movie stories, we have a last speaker for today, which is Mike Snyder. Mike is professor and chair of the Genomics and Personalized Medicine at Stanford University. And in fact, he started first to perform large-scale functional genomics projects, and later on also performed the first longitudinal detailed integrative personalized omics profile, which means he is the person that has most data being gathered on longitudinally. So which is of course an interesting exercise to see how health is evolving and how healthy living perhaps is impacting our health condition and being able to prevent diseases. So with that, I would like to give the word to Mike.
Hello, hi. Well, I hope you can hear me. Can everyone hear me okay? I don't hear any objections, so I guess I'll assume that's yes. All right, great. Well, my talk's going to pick up perfectly from that discussion because we're going to talk about healthcare, not sick care. And you can see what you think with the approach that we've been using. So I'm going to start with this premise that you guys just touched on, which is that medicine is flawed in many, many different ways. We are very focused on treating people when they're ill. As such, it's very reactive. When you're measured these days, when you're healthy, they actually measure very few things. And I would argue some of those measurements are quite poor. The frequency with which you get measured when you're healthy is actually not very common. And here's the worst part. Nearly every decision about your health is based on population-based medicine. Instead, we just heard from this discussion, we should be focused on keeping people healthy, as such be very proactive. We're certainly capable of measuring many, many more things. The frequency, I would argue, should depend on what you're at risk for and what your personal trajectories look like. So are you heading in an unfavorable fashion? And here's the last part. Nearly every decision about, I would argue, decision about your health should be individual-based rather than population-based. And physicians will say we do that now, but I would argue not at the level at which we're capable. And so we should be very focused on precision health rather than precision medicine. So just to illustrate this point, sorry, this is in Fahrenheit. Some of you can translate over, but we've been told since we're little that our temperature when we put a thermometer in our mouth is 98.6. But if you look at the studies out there, first of all, that number is not right. It's more like 97.5. Mine personally is 97.3, and it's been dropping. But the more important point is this here, that there's a spread. So this is the 25th quartile, 94.6. Here's the 75th quartile, 99.1. So in the US, if in today's world, if this is your normal baseline temperature, 94.6, you walk into a physician's office, they measure you at 98.6, which is 37 degrees centigrade. They'll tell you you're healthy, everything's fine, but you're at 4 degrees Fahrenheit. I guarantee you're not healthy. That's not healthy if you're up 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the theme we have that we think is very, very important is to know what your healthy baseline is so you can see the shifts from that. So your health is influenced by many things. I'm sure you guys talked about this throughout the meeting. Your DNA is one of these, but there are many, many other things as well. Activity, exercise, food, stress, various exposures, these all contribute to your health. And we're in a world where it's now possible to measure pretty much all these, some well, activity through sensors. Food is clunky, but still doable. Stress indirectly, and these exposures, actually, our lab's spending a lot of time on. Europe actually has some major initiatives going on here. More importantly, though, you can measure the impact of these on a person by doing deep molecular profiling. And so a number of years ago, we set up as a research study this longitudinal personal omics profiling. We call it basically integrated personal omics profile. So we'll sequence people's DNA once, so we'll determine their DNA sequence, but then we'll do these deep molecular measurements, omics measurements they're called. This will be the DNA methylome and all your RNA. We'll measure this out of blood cells. These will measure out of your plasma, so proteome, cytokines, metabolites, lipids. These also get measured out of urine. We'll measure your microbiome. I'm sure you all know this is important for your health, gut, nasal, more recently tongue and skin. We do deep clinical testing, questionnaires. We have some advanced tests, stress echocardiograms. You'll see this is a very glucose-focused study because actually I'm type 2 diabetes, to jump ahead to a punchline. And we also, about 8 years ago, started using wearables. And so one aspect of this is to collect very, very deep data on people while they're healthy. And then the other aspect is to do it longitudinally. So we'll sample people every 3 months while they're healthy. We've been running the study. Well, I was actually the first person for 11 years, but most people we've been studying for about 8.5 years. It's a smallish group. It's meant as a pilot to see the value of these technologies. And so you might ask, well, why are we, I forgot, we also do additional samplings when adverse events come along, like viral infections. People have heart attacks, that has happened, and so on and so forth. And so you might ask, why are we doing all this? Well, we're trying to understand what it means to be healthy. How does that change over time? How does that compare between different individuals? What happens when people first become ill? And perhaps most importantly, can these advanced technologies that were emerging at the time and still are, can they be used to better manage people's health? And so for the purpose of this group, I'll focus on that last point. It turns out these technologies can be quite powerful. Just in the first, it was 3.5 years, we had 49 major health discoveries, okay? And it spanned a wide range of different areas. Now, it's an older cohort, 53.4 average, some older, some younger. But basically, we found things in the area of hem-oncology, cardiovascular disease, metabolic health, so on and so forth. And what was powerful about this is that these are all found before symptoms. It was done because we were doing these deep data screens on people. And it was no one technology did it. So found these things. So sometimes it would be down here, we caught someone with early lymphoma that was found through imaging and actually several blood biomarkers. These are precancers. I don't know if you've heard of them, MGUS smoldering myeloma that can convert to aggressive cancer. So it's very useful to have found that. That was picked up from biochemical markers. 2 people with serious heart issues, one found through genomics, another through wearables, and so on and so forth. So again, no single technology found these, but the combination was very powerful as a whole. And so just to give you a few examples, it turns out that genome sequencing was quite powerful. This came up in the last discussion. These are what are called Mendelian changes in DNA. So single mutations that put people at high risk. And just from the first 70 people, 12 actually, and a 13th if you count pharmacogenomics case, had something very, very important they learned from their genome. So these are cases, again, where a single gene can lead to a high frequency of disease. Here's a classic example. I'm sure you're all familiar with BRCA. So people with BRCA mutations, women have a 50% chance of getting breast or ovarian cancers. That's very useful information to know. But there are other genes out there as well, just not as famous. And so it turns out that there were 3 individuals who actually learned something. So all this is important for all these folks, but 3 actually learned something where it turned out to manifest itself. So as an example, this individual was a young person, turns out as a mutation of cardiomyopathy gene. And it turns out his father died in the 60s of a heart attack, and his aunt had one in her 50s. And he did a stress echo follow-up, and sure enough, he's got a defective heart. He's on medication now, all picked up because of his genome sequence. Here's an individual, also a young woman. There are 2 who had mutations in this gene, but the one actually did a whole body MRI follow-up and had early thyroid cancer. That was removed. She was able to keep most of her thyroid, so she doesn't need thyroid replacement therapy. 9 individuals coming into the study were thought to be type 2 diabetic. Well, one of them turns out to really be a mutation in this gene, which means they're a MODY mutation, not a typical type 2 diabetic, and they've been on the suboptimal medication for years. So the point is that from the genome sequence, it wasn't a majority, but if you're one of these 12 people, it's a pretty big deal. So again, they all learned something important. And then one individual also turned out to be me, learned something important from their complex disease risk score. That's a different area, but we'll talk about that later. Other technologies that were powerful, I mentioned imaging was useful for picking up the lymphoma. That was because this person had a large spleen, also had elevated blood markers. Here's a case of one of the precancers I mentioned. So there are 1,000 samples here. This one person, also pretty young, his 2 samples just had way more IgM than anybody else's, the other 998. And follow-up tests said, actually, yeah, he has too many IgM producing cells, and so he'll get screened. I have my own ideas what he should do. I should point out I'm not an MD, so you can ignore everything I'm saying, and maybe that's why everything I'm saying will be a bit heretical. Coming into the study, we're very interested in diabetes and cardiovascular disease. As I mentioned, I'm actually type 2 diabetic myself. So coming into the study, 9 individuals were thought to be diabetic. Well, 2 individuals were diabetic who didn't know it. And this is a big deal when you're talking about prevention. Many people are pre-diabetic. It turns out, in general, 9 out of 10 pre-diabetics have no idea. I guarantee a lot of you listening to my talk right now are pre-diabetic and have no idea. We're also very interested in how people become diabetic. It's one of the reasons we ran the study. Nobody's really followed this in detail. And so during the first, it turns out, 3.5 years, 9 individuals became clinically diagnosed as diabetic, and others had diabetic range values, and others became pre-diabetic. So both these categories enlarged. And we looked at how they became pre-diabetic. Well, 2 people became diabetic because they gained weight. Very typical way. They gained weight, their microbiome diversity dropped. They later went on metformin and such. But the other 7 did not gain weight. They actually maintained their same weight, but 5 of the 7 just gradually became diabetic, either through an increase in fasting glucose, that's the orange line here, they just gradually went up, or in hemoglobin A1C is the gray line, this is another way. And this person then did an intervention, I think metformin came down. This person became diabetic through something called an oral glucose tolerance test. They were first diagnosed that way, and these tests tease out different things. I actually think that's important. Well, it turns out, so 5 of the 7 who did not gain weight gradually became diabetic, but 2 people spiked their way there. This is me, actually. This is 8 years of data. So I've been following me in detail for a long, long time. I have 2 petabytes of data around myself. And the bottom line is I first became diabetic after a nasty viral infection, respiratory syncytial virus. So it was the first time people had associated type 2 diabetes with a viral infection. It had been suggested for type 1. And so I originally got it under control because I discovered it because of my genome sequence. So I was getting monitored kind of closely. And I got it under control. This looks like a little blip. That's about 10 to 12 months. And I had to change my lifestyle, basically. I cut out all sugars. I had been biking. I doubled my biking. I started running, and I gradually brought it down to normal. And then, in fact, it was so boringly low. This is about 3 years of data. I stopped looking at it. And ironically, someone else saw it here and said, Mike, you're back to diabetic again. My hemoglobin A1C was 7.0 and it got up to 7.1. 6.5 is actually the threshold for diabetes, so I was over that. So it turns out I'd stopped running, guess when? Right there, to one of the points made earlier. I also had another viral infection. And so basically, it's not clear whether it's a viral infection or running that triggered this. And so I should say overall, what we think is that I'm genetically predisposed, like because of my polygenic risk score. I'm way at the far end distribution for this genetic test. And we think then the viral infection triggered it. So I did start running again. I was able to bring it down, but never all the way down to normal. And it just gradually kept going up, even though I was running. I was running about 4 days a week, 4 to 5 miles a run. And it was about as much as my schedule could handle. It just kept creeping up and up and up. So finally, you can't tell, but I shifted from running to weightlifting because muscle mass is better for glucose homeostasis. That failed. I kept going up as well. And then finally, I bit the bullet and did what everybody told me to do. Mike, take metformin. That's the frontline drug for type 2 diabetes, which I did. And guess what? I'm a non-responder. I kept going up. I went all the way to 7.5. And you know what turned out to be the solution for me? More data. So it turns out that, here we go. We did additional measurements. I'm insulin sensitive. I'm also, I make insulin just fine. But it turns out I don't release it from the pancreas. And you can measure this in several ways. One is glucose disposition. My glucose disposition is just extremely slow. And it turns out there's a drug for this called rapinolide. And that actually works like a charm. So actually that dropped my hemoglobin A1C a lot. So did something called SGLT2 inhibitors. They work pretty well. So this is what we call precision diabetes. By better knowing what's wrong with me, I can take the right drug and get the best response. And so that's basically where we are now. That kind of analysis sounds super expensive, but a cheap version of this could be done on everyone with type 2 diabetes. So one of the things we learned from this profiling is shown here, and this is one of the most important concepts I'll give you, which is that everybody's different in their personal profiles, and those profiles are pretty stable. So I'm just showing 12 people with had 10 healthy visits, and it doesn't matter which measurement type we use, whether it's your cytokines, your immune markers, your metabolites, your clinical lab test, transcriptome. Every dot here is a different visit. Every color is a different person. For me, there's 6 years of data here, and you'll notice my dots all cluster together. This person, the red person's together, blue, and so on and so forth. That doesn't matter which test you use. Even this one, if I were to show you in 3D, would separate people out by individuals. So your personal profiles are very personal. They don't change that much over time. A little bit, but not that much. Not only that, if you undergo a viral infection or gain weight and lose weight, here's a case where people did an acute exercise bout. They ran to the VO2 max. They actually, half your molecules will change if you shift to your VO2 max, but your profiles still look more like you than anyone else. So this is a big deal because what it means is that the difference between you and say a sick you from viral infection is less than the difference between you and someone else. So when you're trying to compare, if you're sick and you're trying to compare your profile, what's going on, by comparing you to 500 other healthy people, it'll fail miserably because, again, the difference between you and those people is just too big. But if you're comparing the sick you with the healthy you can't miss it. So this is why I encourage everyone, you need to get your healthy baseline so you can see your shift from that baseline. Then it's very easy to detect disease. But if you compare you with others, it'll fail. And that's the most important thing I can tell you from the talk. People always ask me, Mike, well, how are you going to scale this to, to others? And so I'm in Silicon Valley. So what you do is you form a company. And that's what we did. And it actually, it's a concierge company in a sense, because people have to pay out of pocket because, again, the system's broken. There's no government system to pay you in the US to keep you healthy. Everything's geared towards sick care. But it turns out they have very similar results to what I showed you in the research. It's a medical version. It doesn't do all the same things I told you. It's much more actionable information. They also do whole body MRI, which in the US, everyone will tell you not to do. And we think that's wrong. The issue is we all have nodules. Everybody's got nodules. Everybody sitting and listening to this talk has nodules. The question is, are any of them growing? That's what you want to know. Do you have any growing nodules? And the way you'll know that is by longitudinal profiling. But anyway, we did do this on this group of people. Again, it's an older bunch of folks. And just in the first 100+ people, we found some things that are pretty big deals: leukemia, fatty liver, so on and so forth. Some of it was picked up by having multiple measurements, advanced measurements, like I said, and some of it was picked up by longitudinal profile, including this early pancreatic cancer, which is almost never found. It's picked up because we could see a change in the MRI pattern. And so again, we argue longitudinal big data profiling does have space. This test costs $3,500. We can come back to that in the questions, whether that's a good thing or not. Now, the other area we're doing a ton in is in the wearable space. So we've been exploring this back since they came out as fitness trackers. And we said, well, gosh, these are probably pretty good physiological health monitors. They're powerful because they measure you, every day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and they make hundreds of thousands of measurements on you, even the cheapest devices. In the US, 20% of the population, 50 million people, wear a smartwatch, and they can track all kinds of different things: heart rate variability, and these are fairly accurate. Respiration, so. Skin temperature can be accurate, depends on the device. Blood oxygen, blood pressure, not so accurate, but the deltas are just fine. And so I'm a big believer in this. I use 8 of these devices every day. And if you look up at me, you can probably see I'm wearing 4 smartwatches here. I have an environmental exposure. I wear a continuous glucose monitor. I do the whole shebang. So anyway, we actually showed that these things could be used for detecting illness pretty early on. And we actually stumbled into this because I actually figured out my Lyme disease, of all things, from a simple smartwatch and a pulse ox. And so the story behind this is, I was flying to Norway. Well, let me back up. I was putting up fences in rural Massachusetts where 55% of ticks are Lyme infested. And then 2 weeks later, I was flying to Norway through Frankfurt. And on that last flight, I noticed my blood oxygen was abnormally low and my heart rate was high. And we went on to show, actually went later, and it was before I had symptoms. And then I did got symptoms, went to a physician in Norway who recommended penicillin. And I said, no, I need doxycycline. Got a little tense there. But anyway, he did give in, took doxycycline, cleared it up. And the point out of this, though, is I was able to detect my Lyme disease pre-symptomatically from a smartwatch and pulse ox. So then we looked at the 2 years of data I had, and it turns out I was ill 4 times. The Lyme time, these are just daily resolution measurements. Lyme, a viral disease infection here, another one here. We know what viruses they are. This time here, I had high C-reactive protein, meaning I was ill, but I was asymptomatic. I didn't know it. I picked it up because you can tell I measure me a lot. So the point is, every single time I was ill, we could pick it up by high resting heart rate and high skin temperature. And generally, you can't miss these measurements. So we went on to write an algorithm called change of heart. It works well in heart rate. It didn't work well in skin temperature, where we'll follow your baseline. We look for a shift up from your healthy baseline, and we'll pick this up as a signal. It's a sliding window signal, a delta plot, if you will. And every single time I was ill, this is retrospectively, we could pick it up with this algorithm prior to symptoms, okay, every single time. And that's because there's about a 30 to 48 hour incubation period for most illnesses. You'll see for COVID, it's a lot different. They have a much longer pre-symptomatic period. Okay, so this algorithm worked on me. It worked on 3 other people, one of whom got sick twice. So every single time we could pick up people's jump up in heart rate prior to symptom onset. So we published this about 5 years ago, and we were improving the algorithm and actually building an infrastructure. We have probably scare a lot of you, but we think it's highly secure infrastructure that can measure millions and millions of people. And so what happened then, obviously COVID came along. Where we're at, sorry, there's a little dated. I think we're about 80,000 cases a day in the US. So it's so high. And of course, it's starting to go up with the holidays coming. And so everybody's scared that we're going to have yet another big peak. So it's high, it came down over here. And then it's, about to go up again as we hit the holidays. So if you think about how we're doing it now, in the US, this is still the gold everywhere. This is the gold standard, but it's slow, it's costly. It takes about 2 days now. There's so many people using the service, you don't even get next day results. And so your turnaround's very slow and it's kind of costly. So you don't do it every day. We do measurements with temperature, and if you think about it, that's a 300-year-old method, although we use now modern devices that I would argue rarely work. I don't know about you, but when it's cold outside and I walk to a door and they shine the infrared on me, I usually measure somewhere between 33 and 35. So the measurement's worthless, but they let me in anyway, right? They said, well, you're not, over 37, so you must be fine. The whole thing, it's nonsense. So anyway, I would argue we need better ways of measuring people. And so we think the smartwatches have a lot of potential here. All right. So when the COVID came out, hit the US in March, we very, very quickly, we had to approve our study. We partnered with leading companies, Fitbit and Garmin. And right away, we rolled 5,300 people, 32 of which had what we call golden data sets. They were people wearing Fitbits at the time they had a COVID infection. And it turns out they had a diagnosis date and a symptom date. So we could see what kind of smartwatch signal they might have at the time they got COVID. And this is our very, very first case. So here's an individual. This is their diagnosis day. Here is their symptom day. But look when their resting heart rate jumped up. It jumped up 9.5 days prior to symptom. You can't miss that signal. Very, very obvious. And we wrote a real-time detection method. Again, retrospectively, I'll come back to the prospective. By the way, any of you are wearing, I hope you guys are all wearing smartwatches or rings. And if you are, come join our study. It's right there. Maybe we can put it in the chat. All right. So it turns out of the first 32, 26 of them actually got, we could detect signal at or before a symptom. So for 80% of people, and we think we miss it for some because we don't get a stable baseline. And it turns out if you look at the data, it turns out we'll pick up this positive signal 4 days in advance of symptoms, 7 days median in advance of diagnosis. And not only that, it's not specific for COVID. Other illnesses, as you might imagine, will trigger this increase. We have algorithms around mostly around resting heart rate, but they can incorporate steps and stuff too. And so this makes sense, by the way, because COVID has a longer pre-symptomatic period. It's not a big jump up. This is the median number, 7 beats per minute. But some people, it's as little as 2 beats a minute. But because they're measuring you 24/7, you know, if you're up 2 beats a minute for several hours, that's an easy signal to see. So we actually then wrote a real-time detection system. This is retrospectively data again. So here's the COVID case. Once again, pick up the alarm. It follows a sliding window, measures you ahead of, gets your baseline for either 28 days or 7 days, depends on the algorithm. And then we look for this jump up in signal for multiple hours. It takes at least 6 hours to set off, have this thing go up. And so, yeah, it will pick up these resting heart rate jumps. And so here's a case, here's another case. Both these are about 9 days early. Other signals do occur. So they're real signals, they're real stressors, if you will, jumping up your heart rate. A lot of people get signals around holidays. We know alcohol, travel, stress will all, trigger an increase in heart rate. And so you do have to contextualize the information. By the way, 2 drinks for dinner won't do it, but if you really tie one on and hung over the next day, you'll set off an alarm in our system. Here's other illnesses. Even healthy people have these, could be stressors, could be asymptomatic infections. So what we've done now, starting about a year ago, we launched a real-time alerting system. So we, again, want you to join so we can set this up. We built a new algorithm that's a lot more lightweight because we're trying to scale this to the planet. We have about 10,000 people enrolled now. I want to get millions and millions of people enrolled. I actually like to have the whole planet enrolled. We built an infrastructure that can handle it. And what it'll do is it's following you in real time. And if you have a jump up in heart rate for an extended period, you actually have to click on it every day. Soon you won't have to click on it, and we'll see whether you're red or green. And the bottom line is, here's one of our first cases. We shifted the dates just for security because the reason you just heard, not that anybody care if they really stole your heart rate data. But the point about all this is that here's an individual that had a positive signal, had a red alert here, if you will. Their symptoms showed up 3 days later, which is the median. And they were diagnosed the next day. And it works about 80% of the case. Not perfect. We have more to improve, that's for sure. In this case, some of this is retrospective, some of it's prospective data. It's just as good for the prospective data. So the point is we're actually alerting people in real time right now. And not only that, it works on asymptomatic cases, 14 of 18 asymptomatic cases. We'll see a positive signal This is a diagnosis date, in advance around that. And I forgot to say, but we have it working for Fitbit and Apple. It'll work for all devices. We just have more data here so we can prove it. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg because we've been doing machine learning to try and understand what clinical measurements we can make with a smartwatch, because it turns out, right, smartwatches are following your blood, they're following a lot of things, and we can pick up hematocrit, red blood cell, hemoglobin levels from a smartwatch data, but these are not clinical grade values. This is not a clinical grade measurement, but it's enough to tell you, look, something's off. Maybe, you're low, something shifted, and you should go get a real clinical grade test. So it's enough to tip you off because, again, they're measuring 24/7. Here's hemoglobin A1C, fasting glucose. There's a lot of signals in these data, and there's signals around things that we currently don't even measure for health that we probably should be measuring. We're building now personal trajectory profiles on people so we can see shifts from them when people are getting ill. And it actually works for me. And if you want to read more about this, you can read this article here. And the bottom line is we built a dashboard. I'm a believer people should own their own data. And that we built a dashboard that you can download on your phone. We think your phone's going to be your smartest thing in the future, more important than your doctor. Doctors won't go away, but your phone's going to be probably more important than them. And we can bring in wearable data, clinical data, omics data, and display it whatever resolution you want, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, what have you. And the ultimate goal is to set up in my world this, where we're sequencing people before birth, and together with deep omics and wearable data, we can better manage people's health through risk prediction, the early diagnosis, and so forth. So I hope I saved some time for questions. I'll just say I have an amazing lab that's really helped do all this work. George Weinstock's a terrific collaborator, Tracy McLaughlin on the clinical side, John Bernstein on genomics. We have a whole wearables team now, about 25 people all trying to work on this so we can get this out to the world. That's our goal. So I think I saved a little bit of time for questions. Happy to take them if you have any.
Any questions for Mike? There's one there. Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can now.
Yeah, Mike, very nice presentation. But my question is about all the devices that you have, the lack of standards. How do you deal with that? There are a lot of things available, but there is a problem, seems to be a problem with how to get all the data together if you are wearing different devices and you would like to bring all this data together.
Yeah, great question. So people like us and some companies are building platforms for pulling in data. The problem right now, it's hard to get the high resolution data. Like Apple, they'll share things on HealthKit, but it's not the resolution that people like us want it to be able to run our algorithms. But it's better than nothing. So there will be better data sharing methods because it's new. You're right, it's not that well orchestrated. But in the future, I think this is going to become standard where you'll have a port for pulling in data. Every hospital will have, or every health plan will have some method for pulling in people's wearable data and then putting it there. On the issue of accuracy of the devices, again, some measurements are very accurate. Heart rate, we would argue, is much, much more at least consistent, and we think accurate than what you measure in a physician's office. Even though the device itself might be off by a few heartbeats per minute, the fact that you can pull somebody's resting heart rate off first thing in the morning is incredibly accurate compared to measuring them when they walk into the doctor's office, where the heartbeat can be all over the map. My beat varies 40 beats a minute in the doctor's office, but my resting heart rate is very consistent first thing in the morning, unless I'm, if I'm ill or stressed, then it goes up.
Okay. Other question there on the right?
Yes, very motivating presentation. I'm really inspired. You being American, do you also think about deals with insurance companies or advertisers?
the ethical debate.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
No, that was it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, two things to say there. Yeah. So people bring this issue up about privacy, just like the last discussion. And here I'll say something that will scare a lot of you. I'd say privacy, get over it. Nothing's private. And so we need laws to protect ourselves. And people, you're sharing your credit card information with a credit card company. And there's incredibly personal information on that. People have no problem with that, and they do it because it's convenient. You don't want to walk around with bags of cash. It doesn't make any sense. So I think we're willing to part with a certain amount of like privacy and things if it helps us. And I hope that we'll head that way. And what you want to do is be protected from being abused. You don't want insurance companies, to your point, people like that getting a hold of the information and then leaving you out to dry. In the US, this is a big deal. I think in Europe, you have a huge advantage over us because you have single payer systems. People aren't, in most cases, booted out of the system. So that's a real issue. And that's why I would argue we need laws to protect people so they don't get booted out of the system by insurance companies who think you're predisposed for things.
Okay. One final question there.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. But I'm a physician and I'm also wondering, if you get the diagnosis of fibrillation at your Fitbit and the diagnosis of this and that and all the other wearables you have 4 wearables or perhaps even more than that, don't you think patients will become scared that there will be overtreatment? Isn't that a possible issue?
Yeah, people always worried about that, especially when we started sequencing healthy people's genomes. Physicians came to me like, what you're doing is absolutely wrong. That's just terrible. You should be sequencing people's genomes. But what we discovered is that you have about, the most you have is typically 3 follow-up mutations that you'll pursue. And it costs about $700. And that, we argue, is worth it if you can discover a BRCA mutation, a certain fraction of the time, or these other things. As I say, 4% of people, it turns out with larger studies now, have a mutation in ACMG genes, which is pretty important to know about. So the answer is, it's not as often as you think. People can handle the information. Yeah, there'll be follow-up tests, but that's why we need cheaper and better, just like COVID. If you have a red alert go off, it's pretty easy where you are to actually get an antigen test. It's 10 times harder in the US. So it's useful, don't you think, to know if your heart rate's been jumping up especially if it's up for a day, something's off. And you're either mentally stressed, you've been drinking way too much, or it's up in the mountains where the altitude's high. Or maybe if you're sitting around listening to boring Mike Snyder and your heart rate's running up, well, you've probably got something wrong with you. So you probably should go get some sort of antigen test. So you can contextualize the information and interpret a lot of it for yourself, right? People are wearing these. We've actually asked them, right? We have thousands of people in our study, and they say it's about right. Something it's a little too much for the alarms. So I want to give them control to dial it up or dial it down. We don't have that now, but we will. So you can decide how often you want the alarms to go off. If you turn it up, if you're a healthcare worker, maybe you want the alarms to go off a lot, so that you're not infecting other people, right? You want to maximize your sensitivity. But maybe if you're just sitting around not that exposed so much, you turn it down. So I'd like to give people the control for that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mike, for your very interesting presentation.
Probably last time you invite me, but anyway, all right. Bye all.
Okay, so we're at the end of the session for today. And that means, we heard quite a lot this afternoon. So we heard from Olivier talking about the STAR Research Data Repository, where he was fusing, let's say, data fusing multimodal types of data, combining imaging with genomics, even claims data, and also death and social security registration data. And he was then explaining, well, we turned that into more like information to be able to stratify patients. And he mentioned there that he is using CNN, which is not the television station, but the convolution neural network method that he was explaining to stratify survivors from non-survivors. And to also be able to predict in an early way cancers. Then we had a very interesting debate where quite some statements have been made. Our healthcare system is just not good enough, was the opening, I think, of the debate, with quite some discussions about, we have all the technology, Elisabeth, and why can't we do more? Well, we heard from the government, Nick Marly, saying, yeah, but we have a roadmap for the coming 3 years. We will set up a broker service. We will have the Belgian Health Data Authority linked to the European data space. And we're heavily working on the legislation to put everything in place. But of course, we can't put legislation overnight in place. It will take some time for consultation before this can be implemented. It has also been said, well, let's start simple. We can start with minimum fair principles. We don't have to boil the ocean, but start in a simple way, perhaps also more bottom-up, where we start with simple projects, small initiatives, and develop a process to demonstrate that it works, that it's easy to do it. And then, of course, the topic came into the picture, well, trustworthiness. We have to take care about also sharing for the greater good. So that was, in fact, more like the societal perspective of it. And then we concluded, in fact, the debate in saying, well, we have just to start, we have just to accelerate, and for that we have to work in parallel on multi-stakeholder collaboration at the same time as building, in fact, the different initiatives and put the different pilots and projects in place to use it. There was a kind of remark made in saying perhaps prevention is an easier starting point. Well, I think that was quickly clear. It's perhaps not the easiest thing because there are also a lot of complications there. And then we saw the nice example of Mike with all his wearables, fully tracked and traced for 7 years, trying to analyze the various peaks in his, what he calls multivariate personal profile, where all kinds of information is being mapped and where he was able to identify in an early way certain illnesses or certain disturbances in health coming up. And he even had his personal dashboard where he said, it's better to compare with my previous data instead of comparing with other patients and benchmarking with other patients. So we covered quite a lot today. We looked into the research perspective. We looked also into more the user perspective, the patient perspective. Also the ethical debate came across, and we had a couple of very nice examples of healthcare providers organizing the data in such a way that standard of care or quality of care can be further improved. And I think it's all clear that data becomes an essential element in our health provision, healthcare provision, but also in terms of keeping us healthy and having a better way to understand what keeps us healthy and what not. So with that, I would like to conclude and give the word to Willem to make the final statement.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, we've come to the moment that traditionally somebody comes to the stage and addresses the audience, telling them that, in fact, he or she is between you and the reception, and then says, like, promises, I will keep it short, and then starts talking for 15 minutes. But I will keep it short, indeed. My name is Willem Doog. I'm Co-General Manager of Flanders Bio, one of the organizers of today. And in this role, I would really like to thank a number of people. I would like, first of all, to thank Innovagate and Ingrid Maas for doing an excellent job in being our host today. I would like to thank the team of BioVox, Jeff and Anne, for helping us really very well in organizing this event. I would like to thank my team, Katrien and Stefan, who has been really very active till late hours yesterday evening to get everything done. I would like to thank the scientific committee, VIB, IMEC, KU Leuven, UGent and Janssen for helping us compiling an interesting program, reaching out to the speakers that we've really, top-notch speakers that we've heard today, and coming up with a topic that is really incredibly relevant today, the topic on data. Well, data are sometimes compared to gold, the new gold. And sorry, Lisbeth, you could also call it the spice, for those of you who went to see Dune. I had to include a movie. But indeed, if you start thinking about the comparison with gold, and people make the comparison because of the value of gold and the value of data. But if you start thinking about it, the comparison is valid on multiple aspects. I mean, for those of you who've regularly seen Western movies and you see them, the gold rush, and you see all those guys digging in pits, trying to look for the gold, and someone finds a nugget, another one finds a splinter of gold. Well, in fact, I think that comparison is also valid for data. Everybody's looking for data, is gathering data, is compiling data, but it's a kind of struggle. It's sometimes a kind of battle between data owners. Also, the quality of the gold you find, the quality of the data is very diverse. So I've heard and I've learned today that this is really an important point. Also, the gold business tends to be not so socially or ethically good business. So also there, comparison with data, you should take care of ethics. You should take care of involving the persons and doing it in the right way, in a socially and ethically good manner. But I've also learned today that, well, the technology is there, the concepts are there, and one thing that should make it happen is collaborate. And I think the best way to collaborate, and instead, well, certainly in Belgium, you need to collaborate at different levels, federal level, regional level, collaborate between industry, academia, university, hospitals, big pharma and biotech, etc., etc. And I think that the best way to collaborate is to start with a good conversation, to build the trust. And this is the word that I've really heard in every speech today, was the word trust. So I would like to invite you to build that trust over a glass of wine in the reception. The day is finished. Thank you very much, and hopefully to see you next year.